As we begin our study about the wisdom of Solomon, I'd like for us to talk about the personification of wisdom in the book of Proverbs as a way of introduction. Yahweh possessed me, it'll be seen that it's talking about wisdom, at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above. When he established the fountains of the deep. When he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was beside him, again it's talking about wisdom, like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the children of man. Now, scholars have debated as if this is a reference to Jesus being the personification of wisdom. Paul seems to have thought so, or at least connected Jesus with the idea of wisdom, as he wrote in 1 Corinthians 1, "And because of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that as it is written, let the one who boasts in the Lord." In our talk today, we will be discussing the wisdom of Solomon. For one, to understand what's the backdrop to why Solomon is considered to be so wise, but also to see where that gets us with the backdrop of the basis of wisdom, the fundamental aspects of wisdom. And for that, I'd like for us to turn to the very first proverb. The proverb of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, in justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. So in these opening lines, he's given us an introduction to the entirety of the book of Proverbs, and you might even say the entirety of wisdom literature. This is what we're trying to do: learn, have knowledge, be wise in our old age, have discretion in our youth. But then he boils it down to one instruction. And that is an instruction that is so vital to everyday life. The fear of Yahweh, or the Lord, is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. In our lesson today, we will see that Solomon did not despise wisdom. That at the beginning of his reign, he is going to request for wisdom from the Lord. And this is going to serve as the backdrop to the rest of his wonderful reign, except, of course, the end when he seems to have lost his wisdom. We're now live and in person. We are looking at 1 Kings chapter 3. We're talking about the wisdom of Solomon. And in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 47, we have it said, "Moreover, the king's servants came to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, May your God make the name of Solomon more famous than yours, and make his throne greater than your throne." And the king bowed himself on the bed. And towards the end of this chapter, and moving into chapter 2, David dies, and the throne does pass to Solomon. And so on the one hand, we can ask, as these advisors surround David's bed and say, hopefully Solomon will even be a better king than you. We can assess that. Was Solomon a better king than David? so it's just kind of encouraging because we kind of do the same thing. Was such and such president better than such and such president? Who's the best quarterback of all time? Who's the best? That's something that's always been in the past. They've compared to see how good or how bad, how they measure up to one another. But how can we measure up Solomon? Well, I would say it's kind of a mixed bag, right? The mixed bag is that Solomon achieved the greatness that no other king achieved in all of Israel's history. He was able to bring in all kinds of material wealth. He was able to preside over a vast kingdom. But at the end of all that, we know that it didn't end too well for him, as he is led astray not only by worshiping other gods, but by allying himself with other nations through these marriages. We know about his 1,000 wives, or 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, the purpose of these isn't, he's often castigated as being grossly sexually immoral, and there might be something to that, but the point is that these were political marriages. So by marrying all these people, it meant that he was bringing in these nations to make his own kingdom bigger and better. But what ended up happening once you do that, by marrying these other nations, you're also bringing their gods in with yours and making your power bigger and better. And his real sin was ultimately thinking that he could control and have power over all these things. And so if we wonder who is greater, David or Solomon, the Old Testament person in me thinks David probably has the upper hand in this debate, but it's really kind of one of those, it depends on what you like. But there's no debate as to who will be better than Solomon. Now, I won't turn there, but in 1 Kings 10, verses 1 through 5, this is another one of those typical passages we could refer to Solomon as being this great king. In 1 Kings 10, Solomon is visited by the queen of Sheba. Now, Sheba, it's one of those really enigmatic places. We don't know exactly where it is. It's either in Yemen or in present-day Ethiopia, or perhaps, and I think more likely now, perhaps in both. That is on the very bottom of the Red Sea, where they get close. It seems like there was this kingdom that was based upon gold as well as incense trade that had Sheba, a queen, over the head of it. Now, if you lived in ancient times, it's as far flung as you can be away from places like Israel and Judah. And it was visited by, and the Queen of Sheba came to Jerusalem to visit him. And because they're so far away, and because they're considered to be in the distant part of the world, they're also associated with wisdom. And so in that passage in 1 Kings 10, we read about how the Queen of Sheba visits his halls. She comes with gold and silver and all manner of these precious items, and she poses to him hard questions, and he's able to answer all of them. And it says that there's no breath left in her. By the way, that's the backdrop to Acts 7, where we have the Ethiopian eunuch, right? That he is visiting from the same area, and he's come and he's reading Isaiah 53, and it becomes the thing that eventually leads him to the Lord. Now, I bring that up because the gospel writers go out of their way to point out something about Jesus that I want us to be another one of the main points that we get today. Why don't we turn, keep your hand there in 1 Kings 3, keep your finger there, and turn over to Matthew 12, verse 42. Matthew 12, verse 42. And this passage, it occurs when Jesus is being questioned to give a sign, to say who he is by the scribes and the Pharisees. It starts all the way in 38. And much of it has to do where he says that no sign will be given to you but the sign of Jonah. But in verse 42, it says, the queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. And so I might say that the goal of today's message is to understand how great Solomon was, so that we might understand what Jesus means when he says something greater than Solomon is here. So with all that said, let's turn over, finally, to 1 Kings 3. And we're going to move through this fairly quickly, but we're going to try and cover this whole chapter. And thankfully, much of it is narrative. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. Now, in terms of the overall context of the book, this is really important because chapter 1 deals with a very problematic part of Solomon's reign where he almost doesn't become king. His brother has a coup attempt with some of these upper leadership of David's old army and the priestly establishment. And Solomon barely gets to become king, even though David had said all along, you're the chosen one. Once he becomes king, you can go back and read chapter 2. I like to think of it as the Godfather baptism scene. Anybody seen the Godfather baptism scene, where you renounce Satan and all of his works? Meanwhile, as Michael Corleone is being responded to at the priest, he's having all of the other family heads whacked, right? So it's this contrast. Well, that's kind of what chapter 2 of 1 Kings is, because David basically gives Solomon a hit list of all the people that he needs to deal with, or he's not going to be able to establish his kingdom. At the end of chapter 2, it says, his kingdom was established in his hand after these people have essentially been removed from control. And then the last piece of that puzzle is that Solomon is established as a king because of this alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And his daughter, he's established from the beginning, is set up in the city of David. Now, the city of David is in the southern part of Jerusalem. David conquered this city. The temple itself has not been built. Why do we know that? Well, Solomon's the one who built it. He hasn't built it yet. And so these are in the days, the early part of his reign, when he is yet to build his own house, the house of Yahweh, or the house of the Lord, and the fortifications. And then we get this important detail. Verse 2. The people were sacrificing at the high places. However, because no house had yet been built for the name of Yahweh. Now that in and of itself is important because if we think of one of the most important chapters in the Bible, 2 Samuel 7, this is what David was told by the Lord. David says, God, you've protected me all this time. I want to build for you a house. You've been in a tent long enough. Let's build for you a house to put your name forever. Well, it hasn't happened yet. God tells David that your son will do it, but right before that's actually going to happen. Now, it's important because we're going to find out later that you're not supposed to go and offer sacrifices and burn incense on the so-called high places anywhere you want. Where are you supposed to worship? In Jerusalem only. And so this is an important moment when all of these satellite places of worship are all supposed to be centralized. Those are supposed to be disbanded, and the one place where you can worship the Lord with sacrifice and with offering incense is only in the place that he proscribed in the Jerusalem temple. And so Solomon has some options here. He can go to a bunch of different places to do that. But we find out that he goes to this one place just north of the city named Gibeon, and this is where he receives a vision. Verse 3, very important. Solomon loved Yahweh. We don't often hear verses like that in the Old Testament, but it establishes this relationship that Solomon, the son of David, has. Something that we don't even see with many of the other good kings. Solomon loves Yahweh. And it says he walks in the statutes of David, his father. One of the things that David becomes the paragon, the grade, you will, of how other kings are compared to. We're going to have 20 kings in the north and 20 kings in the south in 1st and 2nd Kings. We won't talk about them all today. But they're interesting, and they're all get graded against David. He was like David, but he did this stuff. He was not like David, and he did this stuff. That's what again and again they're referred to. And Solomon is like David. He walks in his statutes. Only he sacrificed, and made offerings at the high places. Now, why is it bringing this point out? There is never a note of covenant infidelity with David. He is never accused, not even once, of worshiping God, sacrificing to God in the wrong way. Now, he's accused and convicted of some pretty bad stuff, right? The sin with Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah. We have the census business at the end of 2 Samuel 24. But he doesn't step over the line. And so this is actually the most important line of morality, the most important line for the king to not transgress. Not who they worship, which has to be Yahweh alone, but where they worship. And so again, at this time, all these are spread out. And we find Solomon in verse 4, it says, the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Now, without giving you, we could spend a lot of time on this, but without giving you too much detail to lose what our main focus is, the reason why we have a high place at Gibeon is because we learn in Chronicles, in the parallel passage, is because the bronze altar of Moses that had been made in the wilderness wanderings has been set up at Gibeon. So just real quickly here, what happens is the tabernacle is a mobile temple, a mobile cult site where we worship Yahweh alone, where they worship God. And it moves with them through the wilderness, right? Goes to all these different places. It stops where they stop. And just as they cross over, it goes to wherever they go. And eventually it ends up at a place called Shiloh. Remember Shiloh? This is where we have the allotment of the territories and Joshua to all the different tribes. And this is also where we have Samuel. Remember that episode? He's asleep in the tent. And God says to him, Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. And he says, who's talking to me? And he goes to Eli. And eventually says, here I am. And this is where we have Samuel becoming the prophet. Well, in his days, guess what happens to Shiloh? It's destroyed. And so at Shiloh, at the tabernacle, you have a collection of things like the table of showbread, Ark of the Covenant, bronze altar, all of the utensils that had been created by Moses in the wilderness, at actually Mount Sinai, and then they're spread out. How do we know that? Well, they show up at places. The table of showbread ends up at a place called Nob. Here we find the bronze altar is at this place called Gibeon. We know the Ark of the Covenant, it goes all different kinds of places. It goes back behind enemy lines. It makes boils and mice come upon the Philistines. It eventually ends up in another place. David brings it into his city. Now, that is in the city, ready to go into the temple that David will create. And so the picture is then of God's tent has been scattered to the four winds. And David says, let's bring it all together again and make it not a mobile tent. Let's put it in a permanent residence so God can reside among us permanently. And God says, great idea. You're not the guy, your son is. And so Solomon now is the king with the reins in his hand. And he's told, okay, all right, how are you going to do this? And this is that moment right before all these things happen. Because in the next few chapters, it's all about building the temple, building his own house. So with that, he goes to Gibeon. He offers these offerings on the altar. Verse 5, at Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, ask what I shall give you. What a dream. What an experience. I mean, this is, I think it's quite an image. We have this primo biblical character come to by the Lord, much like Samuel, we might say. Well, Samuel he's calling out his name, and he says, here I am, and God gives him instruction. Solomon, God's not saying, Solomon, listen to me. He says, okay, what will you have from me? And so God is giving this offer. If we continue our gangster metaphor, he's making him an offer he can't refuse. And he's giving him this offer. What's he going to choose? And so at the heart of this question then is that Solomon is a young man who's already withstood a likely murder if he does not rise to become the king, as his older brother tries to take it from him. And he's given with this choice. What are you going to choose? And so his choice is of utmost importance. And as we'll look at this, we're going to see that it shows a person who understands themselves in relationship to the challenge of their lives, but also humility. The path to wisdom is marked by humility, which I would say is a huge component of the fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Lord. You cannot have the fear of the Lord, like we talked about in Proverbs 1, verse 7, if you don't have humility. Humility is an expression of the right relationship you have towards other people and especially to God. And we see that in his response. Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love." That word steadfast love literally means covenant-keeping love, which again connects us with 2 Samuel 7. "To your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on the throne to this day." That's actually one of the components of the Davidic covenant. If you go back and read 2 Samuel 7, God says, "Because you have done this, you've requested to build for me a house, there will not fail to be on the throne of your kingdom, the line of David, a son of yours," which obviously ultimately has its fullest expression in whom? Jesus, right? So when Jesus says something greater than Solomon is here, he's not just talking about a point of comparison, he's literally part of the family, right? He's way down the line, but he's still there. "And now, O Lord," verse 7, "my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in." Now we should just say a couple things about this line here. And I'll say already, we don't know all of the information. I am a fan and I like to delve into biblical chronology. We have a lot of information about a lot of the Judahite kings of Judah. Sometimes we learn how long they reigned. Almost all the time we learn how long they reigned. Sometimes we even know how old they were when they started to reign. The two youngest are guys like Joash and Josiah. They started, Sam's too old for him. They started at 8, turned 9 yesterday. Imagine Sam being king. So is the question with Solomon, is he really is he 8? Is he 9? Is that what's being said here? Well, we don't really know, but we do know his ancestry. First of all, we know that David is his father. His mother is whom, do we know? Bathsheba, right? So he is either the second or the third son of David with Bathsheba. We know that because David and Bathsheba both have another son named Nathan, and of course the other child that dies after the adultery. So, but the problem is we don't know exactly when that happened. So he could be anywhere from a teenager to in his mid-20s. We don't really know. We do know he reigned for 40 years, right? So, but if he's become king when he's, let's say, 15 or so, if he's 15 or so when he's making this pronouncement, and he dies after only 40 years on the throne. I mean, 40 years is a long time, but still, he'd only be in his mid-50s. And I kind of tend to think that's what it is. The reason why I'd say that is because God, in this next passage, he says that he will lengthen your days. So if he's really young, let's say 15, and he only reigns 40 years, maybe the reason why he only reigns 40 years is, which would mean he's 55, is because of the sin that he commits later in his life. But at the end of the day, we don't know how old he is when he becomes king. He's a young man. But that's not the whole issue. The whole issue is really tied up not in his age, but in his recognition of humility of who he is in relationship to his father and who he is in relationship to his rivals, Adonijah, and these other kings, and most especially who he is in relationship to God. And for that, having been around many young people who are 15 to 25, who are often too big for their own britches, we can see that he shows very high level of humility, of expressing who he is, the path to wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And that means that we don't act like we know everything. We don't act like we are full of knowledge. Fools despise instruction, right? That's what we read in Proverbs 1:7. Well, Solomon does not despise instruction and wisdom, and he gets it directly from the Lord. Well, let's keep reading. It says, I do not know how to go out or come in. Verse 8, and your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Now, this connection is actually really important. It's not just a throwaway line. He's not pumping up God here. He is making a connection with the covenant of Abraham. What does God tell Abraham? I will make your descendants like the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. Well, if we look ahead to the end of chapter 4, that's exactly what happens in Solomon's reign. It says all Israel is like the sand on the seashore. It's talking about a partial fulfillment anyway of this. So he's saying that I'm a young guy. I don't know exactly how to do all this. I need your help. You're in control of it all. Give me the knowledge. And so we get to his request in verse 9. God says, what do you want, Solomon? What can I do for you? Well, his answer, after, notice, several verses of humbleness, he finally gives the request. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? I would say of all the verses in the Bible, every politician should memorize this verse. This verse is so crucial because the task of leadership, whether it's the leadership of a church, whether it's leadership of a business or a government, and the list goes on, it's all a responsibility given to the Lord. And if we're not relying on the Lord, we're missing our purpose. Because only the Lord can give us understanding to discern evil and good and to be able to govern the people that have been put under us. And so this is his request. This is the request that Solomon gives. And let's read God's response, verses 10 and so on. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for something understanding, for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked. Then I will lengthen your days. Now, the form of God's response to Solomon is actually very important. One, he gives what Solomon has asked. Solomon asked, give me wisdom and understanding. God says, you got it. I'm giving it to you. Then he says, I'm going to give you the stuff that you didn't ask for. Right? You could have asked for vengeance. Right? We could think, there's so many good examples. We can think of Aladdin, the genie. What are going to be your 3 wishes? That's really kind of the thing that the unique circumstance of, what request, I guess if Solomon was smart, he could ask for more wishes. Maybe that would have been the path to wisdom, but that doesn't seem to be an option. He asked for wisdom. He could have asked for wealth. He could have asked for prestige. He could have asked for possessions. And God says, because you didn't ask for these will be given to you. And that's actually a preview of what is to come in the book of Kings. First Kings 1 through 11 detail Solomon's reign. He gets about a quarter of the entire book of 1st and 2nd Kings, and they're all about wealth and prestige and power. But verse 14 is a really important one. Notice the if-then clause. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father walked, then I will lengthen your days. That's also, unfortunately for our friend Solomon, a preview of things to come. Chapter 11 is going to be where that if-then comes to fruition. But I'd also like to talk about the incomparable nature of Solomon in the Old Testament. Every one of these other kings that follow after him, they're going to be graded by the grade of David in terms of their love for the Lord. Solomon himself is graded by David in terms of his love for the Lord. But they're going to be graded in terms of their wealth and prestige, not by the grade of David, but by the grade of Solomon. They're going to talk about how they can get gold and silver and add it to God's temple, how they lose it, and how they never really measure up. And so it's true in the context of the Old Testament, no one becomes as great as Solomon. All that's true. But we need to remember what we read earlier. Something greater than Solomon is here. Well, when Jesus makes those statements, and that's why I purposely read 1 Kings 1:47, may his throne be greater than David. And God says, none of the other kings that follow after you are going to be greater than you. Well, Jesus claims to be greater than Solomon. And the question is, what does he mean greater? Well, one answer is that he's greater in terms of his faithfulness. He doesn't fall like Solomon does. But we'll also see that he's greater in terms of overall wisdom. And if you read the book of Revelation, and if you read about what's coming in the coming at the end of the age, he's greater in wealth. He possesses it all. And so it's a very fitting comparison. Well, verse 15 says, Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Which, notice, to the biblical eyes, if we say that, we wake up in the morning, oh, thank goodness it was a dream, right? It wasn't true. To the biblical authors, that means it's true, right? It's a dream that just happened. I saw God. This happened. It was a dream, and it's going to come to fruition. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, these are separated. He's back in the city of David, and he offers up burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all his servants. So the book of Kings probably could go on and extol all of the different things that Solomon does in terms of wisdom. It gives us one example. And it's the story of the two prostitutes. And I'm just going to read this and comment a few times on it. But you're all familiar with the story. And I think probably the reason why I chose this passage is because recently I came across a fresco at Pompeii, where they have along the wall. Pompeii is a city that was destroyed in 79 AD, just 9 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. And on the walls, they have a depiction of the judgment of Solomon. So you can see Solomon arrayed like a Roman judge and overseeing the two prostitutes that have the child. One is dead, one is not. And of course, he says, as we'll see, divided up. And guess who is looming in the corner? Plato and Socrates. They're trembling at the wisdom and power of the judgment of Solomon. In the Roman world, it doesn't get much bigger and better in terms of wisdom than Plato and Socrates. Actually, it's Aristotle and Socrates in the thing. So it's a really cool image, which shows that there's this lasting knowledge of Solomon well after he lived. Solomon is king, sometime in the 900s BC. Let me go ahead and read it. Two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house." In other words, no witnesses. No easy way out, Solomon. "Only we were two in the house, and this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him.
And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, no, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, no, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. So we get this trial, this accusation there before the king. Now it's important to note that there were many trials that Solomon likely oversaw, but only this one is chosen. Why is this one chosen? Well, it's an impossible case to try based on evidence, right? What is the Old Testament law for how you are to judge true testimony? Right, the mouth of two witnesses. Well, here we have two with no witnesses. It's literally a she said situation. And more than that, why choose prostitutes? What's the thing here? Well, it means that they're by themselves. They don't have obviously a husband. They don't have a family. They don't have an environment even in which people could weigh in on the case. But it also talks about their social status, meaning that they have no, these were people that you would normally not consider to have to really even worry about in society. What I mean by that is, in a society that is structured really in any different period, the wealthy are often going to get the best justice, right? Because and even in our society, we can point to many different examples. Turn on Netflix, you can look at the O.J. Simpson trial, or that the wealthy receive it. So the point is that Solomon is able to make this case with no witness testimony, and he's also able to make it for people who would be considered unworthy of even having this type of testimony. Let them squabble it out themselves. He's able to make this case, which means then, if he's able to do that for them, what can he do for the wealthy, for the widow and the orphan, which are the main tenets of what righteousness is all about in the Old Testament thinking? That if it's good in a particular king's reign, guess what they say? The widows and the orphans are cared for. And so all that's kind of lurking in the background here. And of course, we know what he says. Then the king said, this one says this my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the others say, no, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. And the king said, divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king answered and said, give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. He knows. He's able to figure it out. An impossible situation, he's able to judge with wisdom and righteousness. And then notice the effect. All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And this is the role of the king. This is what we long for, I would say. When we think about our rulers, when we think about those who are in charge of us, we think about even ourselves. We long for this level of justice. And that's actually, I think, what makes it so difficult when we think about the person of Solomon. It's someone who could have so much wisdom and power, how they can distort that power and disrupt it and use it for their own ends, as what will happen with him. And it's with that in mind that we get finally here to the thing that I want us to look at. Something greater than Solomon. We talked about how Jesus already says that something greater than Solomon is here. Let's turn over to Matthew 22, and let's see an example, perhaps the best example, of Jesus acting out his Solomon kingly duty, but even going well beyond what Solomon did. And really the whole section is powerful. You can read it all the Synoptic Gospels. The setting is Passion Week, just days before Jesus is going to go to the cross. Guess where we find him? In the exact same place that Solomon renders this judgment. Where Solomon's residence was, on the Temple Mount, where Solomon would have his hall of justice. Jesus is holding court there. In fact, in Luke's gospel, he says that he is so much in control that no one can carry a jar while he's holding court. He has driven out the money changers. He has established his father's house as the king. If we think about where he was literally seated at God's right hand, because God is embodying the temple, and much of where Jesus' actions were taking place were in, according to John, Solomon's portico. This is the place where Solomon had been. Jesus returns there. And Sadducees and Herodians and scribes and Pharisees, they all come to him with questions. And these questions are meant to trip up Jesus. The Sadducees question, right? They say one woman had a husband who died, and then she married each one of his brothers. Whose wife is she in the resurrection? Jesus responds and says, you don't believe in the power of the resurrection, you're mistaken. And he shows how they're wrong. And the Pharisees come with and the Herodians come with their question, and so on and so on. Do you see the similarity? Do you see the similarity of what Solomon did? He answered an impossible case. He gives judgment on an impossible case with the right answer, seemingly that we can't come up with on our own, because Solomon has the wisdom from God. But Jesus doesn't just have the wisdom from God. According to passage that we read in 1 Corinthians, he is the wisdom of God. Right? That's what Paul says. He is the very wisdom of God. And we can connect that with what we read earlier in Proverbs 8. God possessed me at his work. At the beginning, he created everything through wisdom. Jesus is that very wisdom. And so at the end of all of that, at the end of all these questions, after Jesus has made his great statement about the two commandments, love your neighbor and love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, all the law and prophets rest on those. He says in verse 41, now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. So they'd had their time. Now Jesus gives his time, saying, what do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. Why would they say that? Well, 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant, Solomon was the son who continued that line. He said to them, how is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies at your feet? There he is quoting Psalm 110. He's basically saying, there's three people there. David's writing, and the Lord says to my Lord, which in Hebrew is Adonai says to Yahweh. So he's talking about David referring to this relationship between these two individuals, which he's saying is me. I am the Lord seated at the right hand of God. If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word. Nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Do you see the similarity between place, impossible questions, impossible judgments, and incalculable wisdom and power? And for an original reader of the Gospels to see Jesus on display, how much their hearts must have yearned to finally see true justice, true wisdom on display. And the truth is, because something greater than Solomon was there, and yet he's still around. He's seated at the right hand of the Majesty on high, exactly where he says that he is in this passage. And so I think that the study of Solomon, the study of wisdom, it's both a letdown, because Solomon really screws up, but it's also the ultimate high, because we realize that someone was going to come much greater than Solomon and be much wiser and be able to fulfill it all the way to the end. And so with that, let's pray. God, we thank you for this time we've had to look at wisdom and to look at the paragon of wisdom of Solomon. And we thank you that you gave him wisdom, you gave him power and strength and riches and wealth and all those things. But we thank you that you sent someone much greater, far more powerful to complete that. We thank you that we worship the very wisdom of God.